Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Interim Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Anthony Doerr, author of 2 novels, About Grace and the forthcoming All the Light We Cannot See. He's written 2 collections of short stories, The Shell Collector and Memory Wall, as well as the memoir 4 Seasons in Rome. Doerr's fiction has won 4 O. Henry Prizes, the Rome Prize, 3 Pushcart Prizes, the 2010 Story Prize, and the National Magazine Award for Fiction, among others. He was awarded an NEH Fellowship in 2002 and a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2010. Doerr gave a reading at the University of Oregon on May 1st, 2014, as a guest of the Creative Writing Program. Anthony, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Your latest novel, All the Light We Cannot See, will be released next week. How did you get the idea to write this book? Where did this idea come from?
The short answer is that I was at Princeton for a year. These are the old days when your publisher didn't email you the jackets for the book. I had just finished a novel, and they wanted to show me the designs for the jackets, so they were still on paper. I took the train up, and we're entering Penn Station. I think it was Penn Station. We're going underground. The man in front of me is on a cell phone. It's like a 2004, Qualcomm cell phone. He was talking about The Matrix. I remember this very clearly, The Matrix sequel. And his call dropped, and he got physically angry. He the classic embarrassing rage thing. And I was partly amused, but partly also thinking, here we are, we're 70 feet underground, probably there's steel and concrete. He could be talking to somebody in Spain, for all I know, or Florida, thousands of miles away, and he's angry that this miracle has ceased to exist for a second. He's using invisible electromagnetic energy, high-speed microwaves, to send words to somebody else, and this little transmitter and receiver. So I had my notebook with me, and even though I was only about a month out of finishing About Grace, I started thinking, I want to write a story in which the power of radio is somehow reconjured, and we remember what a powerful thing it is to hear the voice of a stranger in your home. Now my wife and kids leave the house and it feels quiet to me, and I'll turn on CNN just for the noise of it. But for the history of humanity, you couldn't do that. You couldn't hear the voice of a stranger unless you were looking at a stranger. So I set the book in World War II in a time when I felt like radio was the paramount technology. And the book it's about 2 children, but it's just particularly about the power of propaganda and Nazi propaganda, especially in the minds of poor and undereducated people, to change how they feel about the world, and also as a tool of resistance against the Nazis, particularly in this book in occupied France, and how people would risk their lives, not necessarily even to broadcast resistance messages as much as just music, just to play music, to have some autonomy over what they were listening to.
So tell us about the central characters, the 2 central characters of the book.
There's a French girl who happens to be blind. Her name is Marie, and her father works at the Natural History Museum in Paris, and I just wanted to imagine what an amazing place that would be to grow up and to be a child. He is the chief locksmith, and he works in this key pound with thousands of keys, and he's always putting things in her hands to help her identify them, and he's taking her through the city and helping her try to figure out her way home. He even builds miniature models of their neighborhood so that she can use her fingers to try to memorize how many street lights, how many sewer drains between buildings, really trying to help her become a self-sufficient person. All skills she'll need once of course they don't know that's coming, but once the Germans invade in 1940. And the other main character, protagonist, is a boy named Werner Fenning. He's a German orphan. He grows up in a coal town. He has a much less rich upbringing than Marie. And in that town, all the boys, when they turn 15, are supposed to go work in the mines. His father has died in the mine, that's why he's an orphan. But he's very gifted with radios, and that's kind of where the fascination with radios in my own life starts to come into the book. He ends up repairing a radio for a German party official who recognizes the kid might be a prodigy, sends him to this paramilitary school, which at first you're excited about because you think Werner might be getting a way out of the mines. But it turns out it may actually be a much more morally complicated path than it looks like.
Can you explain the book's title?
Yes. The title came to me early, really those first days after that train ride. All the Light We Cannot See suggests, first and foremost to me, all the electromagnetic light that's circulating all around, especially now. I think about all the text messages that, I'll be late, honey, get avocados, I hate you, all these things zigging past us. That's all carried on light we cannot see. But then, of course, I think it's also hopefully a metaphor for these stories of these children, all these stories from the war that we can't see. I worry a lot now that World War II is becoming more something of history and less something of memory. Every day we're losing thousands of people for whom the war was memory. That it's becoming, especially to my kids, it's becoming more of a good versus evil History Channel kind of video game, comic book narrative. And of course that's not true for everybody, especially somebody who's reading a lot of books about the war, but I wanted to complicate that and suggest maybe that Werner might be as sympathetic an individual as Marie, even though he's a German citizen at a time when atrocities are happening around him.
Would you be willing to read a bit from the novel?
Sure, yeah, it'd be fun. Thanks for asking.
You're very welcome.
Maybe I'll just read a tiny bit from Werner's upbringing. This is 1934, and he grows up near Essen, Germany, in a place called Solferein. Werner grows up 300 miles northeast of Paris in a place called Solferein, a 4,000-acre coal mining complex outside Essen, Germany. It's steel country, anthracite country, a place full of holes. Smokestacks fume and locomotives trundle back and forth on elevated conduits, and leafless trees stand atop slag heaps like skeleton hands shoved up from the underworld. Werner and his younger sister Jutta are raised at Children's House, a clinker brick 2-story orphanage on Victoriastrasse, whose rooms are populated with the coughs of sick children and the crying of newborns, and battered trunks inside which drowse the last possessions of deceased parents, patchwork dresses, tarnished wedding cutlery, faded ambrotypes of fathers swallowed by the mines. Werner's earliest years are the leanest. Men brawl over jobs outside the Solferein gates, and chicken eggs sell for 2 million Reichsmarks apiece, and rheumatic fever stalks Children's House like a wolf. There is no butter or meat. Fruit is a memory. Some evenings during the worst months, all the house directress has to feed her dozen wards are cakes made from mustard powder and water. But 7-year-old Werner seems to float. He is undersized and his ears stick out, and he speaks with a high, sweet voice. The whiteness of his hair stops people in their tracks. Snowy, milky, chalky, a color that is the absence of color. Every morning he ties his shoes, packs newspaper inside his coat as insulation against the cold, and begins interrogating the world. He captures snowflakes, tadpoles, hibernating frogs. He coaxes bread from bakers with none to sell. He regularly appears in the kitchen with fresh milk for the babies. He makes things too, paper boxes, crude biplanes, toy boats with working rudders. Every couple of days he'll startle the directress with some unanswerable query. Why do we get hiccups, Frau Elena? Or, if the moon is so big, Frau Elena, how come it looks so little? Or, Frau Elena, does a bee know if it's going to die if it stings somebody? Frau Elena is a Protestant nun from Alsace who is more fond of children than of supervision. She sings French folk songs in a screechy falsetto, harbors a weakness for sherry, and regularly falls asleep standing up. Some nights she lets the children stay up late while she tells them stories in French about her girlhood, cozied up against mountains, snow 6 feet deep on rooftops, town criers and creeks smoking in the cold, and frost-dusted vineyards, a Christmas carol world. Can deaf people hear their heartbeat, Frau Elena? Why doesn't glue stick to the inside of the bottle, Frau Elena? She'll laugh, she'll tussle Werner's hair, she'll whisper, they'll say you're too little, Werner, that you're from nowhere, that you shouldn't dream big, but I believe in you. I think you'll do something great. Then she'll send him up to the little cot he has claimed for himself in the attic, pressed up beneath the window of a dormer.
Wonderful. Stop there. Your ability to create tremendous depth of feeling in readers, of character and place, by this tremendous precision in the details, both details of place and history and details of character. I mean, you just read, what, a page and a half? Yeah. The richness of this is so amazing.
That's so nice, thanks.
On the question of the historical precision, right, the beginning of the passage you read, the cost of tell us about your research. How do you research for projects like this?
Yeah, so this book took me 10 years to write. So that was 2004 when I had that train ride. And part of it is that I had never taken on such a large project, or one in which I couldn't readily imagine. If you asked me to set a story in Eugene, I've been here 24 hours now, but I could at least know that in Subway they have paper napkins, or that the street is made of asphalt similar to the asphalt in Boise. But in 1934 in Germany, a lot of these things I hadn't lived there. When you go there now, things are different, and so it's hard. You have to do a lot of looking at photographs, and that's where I would start. Looking at old photographs, sometimes even looking at Sears catalogs from the United States, just to try to imagine what's in people's rooms, what might be on a dresser, what a hairbrush looks like, what kind of social support systems were there for orphans in 1934. I didn't know those things. How much, I didn't make up any of that stuff. That's how much a carton of eggs cost during the huge, fumbling, nightmarish depression that Germany was in, between the two wars. A lot of the economic might of the country came from these coal-bearing areas where they're making steel, and really driving the military-industrial complex back to its greatness was what got them out of the Depression in some ways. So, I just would look at pictures and use your imagination, and then try to use your memories and make a kind of a triangle out of those three things.
You're a writer who writes in all different genres, so short stories, novels, memoirs, but you also have a science column that you write.
I do, yeah.
So
that's right.
You've said that writing fiction is often an excuse to explore curiosities.
Yeah, oh good, that's right, good research.
Can you tell us what you mean by that, and why that's how you think of fiction writing, but also it seems to me that's how you think of writing?
It is. I kind of got into fiction writing just because I loved learning about different things. My graduate students will sometimes complain because I'll make them do research-based projects. And they're like, we got into creative writing to make things up. I'm like, well, good, make things up. But I think I'm always most interested in books where I'm learning something. And that doesn't mean you're learning how violins are made necessarily. You're learning that people in Afghanistan cry for the same reasons people in the United States cry for, or maybe people on Mars in 2300, or whatever kind of fiction you're drawn to. If it's well done, you're learning something about the human condition that makes you feel less lonely, that makes you feel less isolated. And that's why I'm mostly drawn to fiction. You feel empathy for Emma Bovary and Madame Bovary, and you realize she was dissatisfied in the way a lot of my friends are dissatisfied. 1840s France wasn't that different than 2014 in Boise. So yeah, I think my interest in science, I think even being here on this university campus, it's fun to visit with students. I think I urge them to not dive into specialization at such a young age. I think, why not go take a Russian literature course, even if you're studying computer science? If you have the opportunity to do that, do that. Take computer science if you're studying geology, or if you're studying geology, go read War and Peace with a professor who knows the book really well, because maybe you might never get a chance to do that again in your life.
In MFA programs all over the country, young writers are told, write about what you know. Write about your own experience. So anybody who looks at your work will say, there are no bald white guys in these books.
Right. Yeah.
So
there are almost no American characters in this
so
entire book.
you write about, almost as if determinedly, you write about people who are not like you.
Correct. At least on the surface.
So say a bit about that. Why is that the case? And when you say that last thing, at least on the surface, explain about that too.
For example, my last book was called Memory Wall. In the title novella, there's a woman, a South African woman, who's fairly racist in her old age, who gets Alzheimer's. And on the surface, we're not very similar. I didn't grow up in Cape Town, didn't have Alzheimer's, obviously, hopefully. And she, she has some pretty strong ideas about white people and black people. And a lot of research has to be done to get a character down like that, to try to understand how she came up, to try to maybe empathize with what she learned as a girl that made her the way she is. She's not necessarily a villain because her memory's being erased, but I want the reader to both identify with her and maybe pity her, but not necessarily think she's a great person. Mm-hmm. And yet, so in that sense, I'm not writing about what I know at all. I have to learn all those things. And yet, I'm relying on my memories of my grandmother who had dementia and was losing her memory. She moved in with us when I was 16 years old, and I was too self-absorbed to understand the pain that my parents were going through, and of course that she was going through. So that's one way I was relying on memory and the things I already knew. And in another, I tried to imagine what it would be like for myself if my memories started to go. Everything that composes yourself, it relies on your ability to remember what happened to you previously in life. And I feel a great terror when I think about those things going away. You know, the oblivion that faces us at the end of our lives scares me a lot. And I think it scares other people too. So in that sense, you are relying fundamentally on things you know. Flannery O'Connor said, by the time you're 14, you've lived enough. You've maybe fallen in love, you've been lost, you've missed your parents, you've been homesick. You've lived enough to write novels for the rest of your life. So in that sense, you are using what you know in terms of human emotion. But if you want to write about horse racing or mollusks or camera operation, you can learn those things. You have to buckle down and study them, but you can learn those things enough to make them persuasive. If you want to have a heart surgeon as your protagonist, go visit a surgery, and you can learn those things. But ultimately, he's going to have a family. He's going to be scared at some point, and those are emotions that you can, that you've got inside of you already.
Anyone who've spoken with you, seen you read, watched interviews with you, immediately experiences this energy that you have about what you do. And I know that you've spoken about cynicism in writing, in fiction, and how you don't consider yourself a cynical writer. And I think it's very clear from everything you said that you're clearly not a cynical writer. There are dark things in your books, but there's this vitality in this life and this positivity. Why aren't you a cynical writer? There's so much to be cynical about.
Yes. Yes. If I start thinking about global warming in particular, yeah, your soul starts to cave in. I feel like I don't believe in reincarnation. I think we get one trip, and if you're really lucky, you get 80, maybe 85 years on this earth, and there's so many amazing things going on. Just this morning I was reading that we found a planet that's about 30 times bigger than ours, but first time we've seen an exoplanet outside the solar system spinning. We've been able to measure its spinning rate, and it spins 30 times faster than Earth, and its year is only about 80 days long. And if I hadn't seen that, my life would be that much poorer. Like, I'm so excited that I understand that. It just reminds you how arbitrary it is that our year is 365 days and that we're, going around our particular star. So I think you owe it to yourself to not sleepwalk through your life. And I think there are writers. Mark Twain can do cynicism beautifully, or a contemporary writer named George Saunders. I really admire his work. He still somehow manages to have really soulful and beautiful characters, even as he's pointing out all these hypocrisies. And that's what a good satirist can do. Even Stephen Colbert, in some ways, I enjoy that sense of humor, even though there's a real edge of cynicism inside of that. I don't want to feel despair. I don't turn to literature to feel despair. I turn to literature to feel more whole, to feel like I'm included in a larger human experience. And the films that don't work for me, the books that don't work for me, they come from a place of cynicism or total irony, where it's even sometimes feels a little mean. You're typecasting people and you're being mean to them. Everybody, if you look deeply enough, is interesting. Even, maybe I shouldn't say this, but even killers, or everybody is somehow there's a reason they are the way they are.
Mm-hmm. I know that one of the ways in which your curiosity gets expressed is that you are curious about literary form. And I know in your short fiction, you're often pushing the boundaries of what it means to write short fiction. So you write these quite lengthy short pieces. Tell us a little bit about the form of this novel. I've read there's some interesting things about the form of it.
Yeah. I don't know if I can hold it up, but there are 187 chapters in this book, and many are less than a page. And I alternate. I read a little bit of Werner's story and then Marie's story. Mostly it follows an A-B structure where I alternate, really oscillate between the two narratives. They don't meet until about page 450 of this 500-page novel. And so you watch them, I hope, these two trajectories, trying to guess exactly how they'll intersect as they draw closer and closer. I have been getting questions lately that, is this a response to the way we read on the internet, these very short soundbite sized chapters? That was not a conscious decision. I think it was because I have children and I'm busy, it was a way for me to break the novel, a big project, into reasonable chunks. And also because I'm a fairly lyrical and dense writer, I felt like it would be nice to give the reader these places of white space, these bursts of recovery time, in a sense, a little bit of oxygen before you dive back into another long description of Germany or France.
You mentioned the white space, and I know that you've thought about it, and you think about books as physical objects. Say a little bit about your view of books as physical objects.
I know. Okay, so I'm only 40 years old, but I've only read on paper. I came up reading on paper. I know that some really interesting and vital work is being done on screens. I am interested in the idea of hypertext, but I feel kind of dated in that. I like reading books, and I like seeing. I even, paid a lot of attention in the production of this book to how the chapters would be laid out, and I wanted to make sure, that there was no orphans on certain pages, and I want to see a reader enter each chapter in a kind of a safe and friendly way so that she doesn't get lost. So yeah, I pay attention to that, and I think I prefer paper. I write in the books I read. And Do you read a lot on the screen?
No, I do not read a lot on the screen, but I'm older than you, so I'm a real dinosaur.
That said, my sons love this Percy Jackson series. They made some
sure.
movies out of it, and it wasn't too long ago. My son Henry finished one, and he still had a half hour in reading time before his bedtime. And my wife said, "Well, why don't you get the next one?" And she goes on her iPad and sucks it magically onto the screen. He's reading in like 3 minutes. He's reading the next book. So it's pretty amazing.
So you've mentioned your wife and your sons. How do you balance your family life with your writing?
I go to work like anybody else. Even before we had children, I've rented an office away from the house. It's just a junky little room, but I can ride my bike, and that way when I'm home, I'm home. I think a lot of writers struggle with, really, especially when you're drafting and composing and trying to understand who these characters are. You're building a house of cards, and if the kids come in and they're like, "Hey, let's play baseball," the house of cards kind of collapses, and sometimes you can never again grab that string that's kind of flown out of your hand. So at least if I'm at work, they know I'm at work, and when I'm home, I can kind of say, I'm here at home. So
do you take your family with you when you go on your research trips?
Rarely, occasionally, but right now we don't quite have the money to do all of that stuff. So usually, if I get paid to go somewhere, I write for Condé Nast Traveler, so I can sometimes tie a research trip into something I'm writing for them. And they're getting older and more independent, though, and yeah, of course, if we can afford to. My third book was a book called 4 Seasons in Rome. We got a chance, an opportunity to live in Rome for a whole year. So the boys were baby twins then. But it was really exciting to get to go there. Of course, they got to do that.
Can you tell us about some of the books or writers that have inspired you?
Yeah, I can do dead people, alive people, men, women.
Choose any number of them.
Let's see, as a kid, I can start early. As a kid, Mom read us Chronicles of Narnia. That was really important to me. I kept asking her, how did they do this? Like, how did they make this world? And she'd say, well, it's just one person, and he's dead. That just blew my mind, the idea that he used little black marks on a white page, very inexpensive materials, and he made Narnia, with his head and little letters. And I think that was the first time I thought, ooh, I'd like to try that magic. I feel that. And then, I went through, I'll admit, to a Stephen King phase when I was like 12 and 13. Even then, I was reading Darwin and Annie Dillard and stuff. I was always reading. Mom took us to the library when she didn't know what to do with us and let us take out whatever we wanted. And this might be interesting to people. Mom didn't censor really what we picked. If I chose, I very clearly remember taking out a book called The Sheltering Sky by Paul Bowles.
Paul Bowles,
yeah. Maybe I was 12, I'm like, Mom, what's hashish? Well, son, that's a drug that people smoke. Okay, Mom. Well, I think she just trusted me to try whatever I wanted. And I think that paid off. Certainly, it allowed me to think that books there's nothing forbidden or scary about them. And then in my 20s, I fell in love with Hemingway, Fitzgerald. Virginia Woolf is somebody I still go back to. She intimidates me in that every sentence is just gorgeous. but it also inspires me. You know, the same thing with Joyce. I feel like Dubliners, I can go back and look at those stories and learn something from them every time. And then living writers, I love this poet who doesn't get read enough, named Anne Carson.
Oh, sure.
She's amazing.
Yeah.
And Cormac McCarthy, who is now quite famous, and you know, I loved him from such an early age, and then Oprah picked this book called The Road, and you almost feel a little disappointed, like, oh, now everybody knows about Cormac. But you know, he's an incredible stylist, and the way he uses the objective point of view, very, very rarely does he intrude into his character's thoughts, and yet you feel a lot of emotion as a reader, and it's something I've tried to mimic in my own work.
Interesting. This is about to come out. Are you working on anything new?
Yeah, the Mint Museum in North Carolina commissioned me to write a piece about the Panama Canal for the 100th anniversary of its completion. So I've been writing a lot about yellow fever and Teddy Roosevelt and dredges and mosquitoes and labor, West Indian labor. So it's very new and early.
That's a nonfiction piece.
It's not. I'm making it a story, but it's. So far, the main character is a real person. His name was William Gorgas. He became Surgeon General. He was really the first person to implement the idea that mosquitoes were transmitting yellow fever. Nobody wanted to believe that. First, yellow fever was just this mystery to people, and then we thought it was filth. Everybody assumed it was dirt. It was a controversial, radical, and very difficult idea for people to accept that mosquitoes were transmitting the disease. So his job was literally to eliminate every single one of this one species of mosquito along the entire route of the Panama Canal. And he asked for about $1 million, and they gave him $50,000 to do it. Pretty powerful story.
Did it work?
It did work eventually. He had some very frustrating months, but as the epidemics increased, you know, we had at one point, I think in 1905, it was 75% flight from white American workers from the canal zone because of either fever itself or terror of getting the fever. People were stampeding onto the steamers to get away. They felt like the place itself was diseased. So eventually he started to Roosevelt himself had to step in and give him funding to, you know, try to eliminate every puddle, every little dish of water. I mean, you know, because that's where mosquitoes breed. Amazing, really heroic and undertold stories. That's what I'm working on now.
Well, we will look forward to reading that when it is done, to hear that heroic undertold story told by you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
I've been speaking with writer Anthony Doerr, author of the forthcoming novel, All the Light We Cannot See. He gave a reading at the University of Oregon on May 1st, 2014 as a guest of the Creative Writing Program. Thanks so much for watching.